Good morning, everyone. Before I start the lecture, I want to remind everyone just a quick announcement that we have. Don't forget that we have C3PO study. We are looking at convalescent plasma for people with mild to moderate COVID, and unfortunately, there's no shortage of those patients these days. If you have someone with suspected of COVID or documented COVID that you're planning to send home, you can just call us. We'll screen the patient, we check eligibility, we come in and do the enrollment. So you just have to, if the patient is being discharged or you think you're going to be discharged, just notify us early. They can come if they have a COVID positive test with them, that counts. If you think they're COVID positive, we have some ration that we can use certain number of rapid tests by the lab, so we can order rapid tests for them as well. Or if you have done it and you have the results, that's good too. But call us early. Yes, no.
I'm just wondering, with more and more things coming out showing that it doesn't work and that there's harms to receiving plasma, even if it's not.
That's a good point. Noah's question is, we have several papers coming out, observational, even RCTs, that are showing that convalescent plasma do not change outcomes. Right now we are doing interim analysis. This is a multi-center trial, and about 200 and change patients have been enrolled. And if the interim analysis showed that it is harmful, we'll stop the trial. But at the moment, we are still, the study is continuing. And remember, how patients with severe illness respond to convalescent plasma might be different from the ones who have mild disease. All right, so the theme for EBM today, we have actually two themes. One is using non-randomized observational trials for therapy questions. And you probably have heard this from me and probably sick of hearing it, that if you're addressing a therapy question, observational studies are only good for hypothesis generating. It's good for giving us ideas for how to plan our RCTs. So when you read the paper today, we intentionally picked this paper because you can look at the biases, easily identify the biases that are involved in non-randomized therapy studies. You can see how the groups are balanced, their baseline characteristics are the same or not. When you do a randomized trial, when you randomize the patients, your 2 groups or 3 groups, they are similar in everything except the intervention that you're testing, right? So when you review this paper, check to see if the groups are the same, because when you do an observational non-randomized study, it's almost impossible to get the groups similar at baseline. Look at the possible biases in who goes into each treatment group, right? If when you randomize the patient, each patient has the opportunity to be in the control group or in the treatment. Here, there are a lot of biases involved into who goes where. And whatever they did to mitigate that problem still might not have been enough. So that's one issue that I want you to pay attention to. And the second one is the issue of loss to follow-up. You frequently hear that the study is finished and they lost certain number of patients to follow-up. How important is this, and how do we address the loss to follow-up issue? This is so loss to follow-up means that you cannot measure the outcome in certain number of patients because they're lost to follow-ups. People migrate, they move to different states, different cities, they transfer their care to other hospitals. Sometimes they just get sick and tired or lose interest, or you lose your way of communicating with them. And so at the end of the trial, there are a certain number of patients that you do not have the outcome measures in them. This is almost every checklist or on every quality assessment tool. You see the loss to follow-up is one of the questions, one of the items that need to be addressed to assess the quality of the paper. This is also called attrition rate. So let's look at an interesting example. This was a study that looked at low dose versus high dose ACE inhibitors for patients with chronic CHF. As you heard, pathologically, the ACE inhibitors help remodeling the heart in patients who have CHF. So the idea was the higher doses of ACE should improve the outcome. So they had 3,000 patients, as you can see, over 3,000 patients, 1,500 patients to the low dose, 1,500 patients in the high dose group, and they showed that high dose ACE was associated with 8% lower risk of death, 12% lower risk of death or hospitalization, blah, blah. Here, these are the numbers. This was called Atlas study. And if you look at the mortality, the tables, the numbers are pristine. They report the results. Everything looks okay. In parentheses, this is just a reminder of previous CDM section. How do you treat an outcome that is disease specific, a mortality that is disease specific? You ignore it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Only all-cause mortality matters. Nothing disease-specific should be measured in an outcome. How do you treat composite outcomes? You treat them with suspicion, right? Because they're generally composite outcomes are created to reach statistical significance. Anyway, going back to what we were talking, this was the table. What the study didn't tell anyone, they requested FDA approval, and there was no mention of loss to follow-up in the paper anywhere. And when FDA requested data, FDA looked at the data, and they were missing 15, some elements of primary outcomes. They had 2 primary outcomes, and some elements of primary outcomes were missing in almost 1,500 patients, right? It was never addressed in the paper that was published. This is a big issue. It's more serious than you think. There was a systematic review. I love the title. It's called Lost It Systematic Review, published in BMJ. They showed that 30% of trials that are published in high impact journals, they do not mention anything about their loss to follow-up. And among those who do it, 42%, they don't tell you when or where the patients were lost. Was it early? Was it just at the time of determining outcome? Because it matters where you lose the patient. And only 7% of them discussed the implication of loss to follow-up. So it seems it is an important issue, but even high impact journals, New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Lancet, this is commonly ignored. So why does this matter? First of all, you do your sample size analysis at the beginning, right? Your sample size analysis tells you need 100 patients in each group to reach certain power for your study. And then you lose 10 patients in each group to follow up. What happens here? Now you're underpowered, right? You cannot ignore this. You're underpowered and you're at high risk of type 2 error or type 1 error, depending on the types of the results. So it affects the power of the study. It affects the validity of the study. There are also some systematic biases that come with this, and some of which, one of them I will talk after this, and one is attrition bias, because how do you know people that were lost to follow-up didn't have certain characteristics that people who stayed in the trial didn't have? Let's say, more people with sick illness, they couldn't complete the follow-up. More people who were elderly couldn't complete the follow-up, and you're leaving them out. it seriously affects the validity of the study. And finally, the same rule applies to generalizability. If you're missing, if your data, your study is missing certain number of patients with certain characteristics, it will affect how generalizable your findings are to everyone. So the attrition bias or loss to follow-up bias is when the people who leave the study have different characteristics from people who remain in the study. And this is a big issue because then you have, you're looking at totally different populations. This is a serious issue for RCTs, for prospective studies, retrospective studies, because there are some elements of follow-up in them. For case control studies, since you're not following, there are no follow-up, there is this change. For case control studies, it's not a big deal, but loss to follow-up or attrition bias affects RCTs, prospective studies, and retrospective studies. How to address this involves two things. One is the denominator, and I'll talk about what I mean by the denominator. When you calculate your outcomes, what denominators should you use? And I'll talk about that in the next few slides, which changed already. So in RCTs, when you calculate your outcomes, your denominator is the number of, Sophia, this keeps changing. In RCTs, the number of your denominator when you're calculating the outcome is the number of patients that were randomized to that group, right? If you randomize 100 patients to each group, when you calculate your outcome, your denominator is that 100 per patient. For prospective studies, everyone that you recruited for the study should be in the denominator. And for prospective studies, thank you. And for retrospective studies, everyone who got the specific treatment in that period should be the denominator. So how you report your numbers matters because then you have to choose the correct denominator for reporting, for calculating your outcomes. And that brings us to the intention to treat analysis. I'm sure you've heard of intention to treat analysis. And that it basically means you analyze the patient in the same group that they were allocated or they were randomized to. If you're looking at medical therapy versus surgical therapy and someone is assigned by randomization to medical therapy and for some reason they end up getting surgery, where do you analyze that patient? In the medical therapy, because that's where they were assigned to. Just don't get this stuff. That's okay. I'll go back. Right. So that's one element of intention to treat analysis, and it follows the real life, because in real life you're going to have people are going to change, people are going to move away. Intention to treat analysis says if you're randomized to this group, you're going to be analyzed in this group. And if you randomize certain number of patients to a group, when you report your outcome, you use that number as your denominator. So I want to volunteer to do the math here. We have a trial that enrolls 100 patients to the treatment group and 100 patients to the control group. 90 patients in the control group completed follow-up, 10 of them died, and 92 patients completed the follow-up in the treatment group, and 6 patients died. What is the mortality rate in the control group? Is it 10 out of 90 or 10 out of 100?
No.
10 out of 100, because we randomized 100 patients, excuse me, we allocated 100 patients to the control group, so our denominator is going to be 100, even though 10 patients were lost to follow-up. And the same thing for the treatment group. We have 6 patients who died, that's 6 out of 100, and not 92. That's intention to treat analysis. This is how you report the numbers. It doesn't fix the issue of it's the right thing to do. It gives you the more accurate number. It doesn't necessarily fix the issue of loss to follow-up, but it's the correct way of doing it. There are some other ways to do it. There's some statistical math that can kind of mitigate the issue of loss to follow-up, like fragility index and some other things. There are a lot of math, a lot of complicated math, and they really don't add any clarity to the issue. One of the best ways of addressing loss to follow-up is to do best case scenario, worst case scenario in the paper. So clearly you can say, if your outcome is mortality, you can say I lost 10 patients in this group. Let's assume all of them were dead, and these are the numbers. Let's assume all of them survive, and these are the numbers. If the numbers are close, then it's reassuring for the readers. But you pretty much put it out there, and they can the readers can decide how to address it. So for loss to follow up, one of the ways, probably the best way to address it is to do best case scenario, worst case scenario. The red flag is when the attrition rate is more than effect size. So let's say excuse me. Let's say Hannah and Sophia are running for chief, right? And Hannah has 10 more votes than Sophia, right? This is our effect size. That 10, the difference in number of votes, is our effect size. And now assume that 5 residents are out on outside rotations, and their votes have not come in yet, right? Do those 5 votes count? Are they going to affect the outcomes? Probably not, because the difference between the votes are 10. So even if those 5 residents vote for Sophia, still Hannah is going to win. So we know the results are not going to change. So the attrition rate is less than the effect size. But if the attrition rate is more than the effect size, so assume that there are 20 residents on outside rotation and their votes haven't come in yet, they can change the outcome of this election, right? So every time you see the difference between the groups that are reported, the difference between the outcome is less than the attrition rate, the outcomes in those people who are lost to follow-up could have changed the outcome or the results of the study, right? Is this clear? The absolute wrong thing to do in addressing loss to follow-up is to throw away the patients. So any paper that tells you that we only analyze the patient or only enroll the patients who completed the follow-up, that means they threw away everyone who didn't complete the follow-up. And we don't know what happened to them, right? So when you read a paper, pay attention. If they say we only included patients who completed follow-up, or they somehow explain that the people who didn't complete the follow-ups were not included in the analysis, that's the absolute wrong thing to do, and you should not believe the results. And this is one example. So a researcher wants to compare decompression plus lumbar fusion with decompression alone in disc herniation, and the data available are all patients receiving either treatment in the past 5 years. So they had 275 patients. Only 190 patients have completed data. So investigators stated as part of the inclusion criteria that only those patients with complete data are included. Therefore, the follow-up is 100%, 190 out of 90. What is the actual follow-up rate, loss to follow-up rate? Right, 85 patients were lost to follow-up and were not included in the analysis. And they could completely change the results or whatever conclusion the paper has. One last reminder of intention to treat analysis. Which one of these A, B, C, D are correct about the definition of intention to treat analysis? Very good. So to recap, the loss to follow-up, the number of patients that are lost to follow-up is a very important element that you should pay attention to every time you read a paper. They have to have an explanation they have to report how many patients were lost, and they have to analyze or explain how those people who were lost to follow-up could affect the results of the paper, right? And there are ways to address this. One way is to report intention to analysis. That means you, regardless of loss to follow-up, you use the denominator, the correct denominator. For RCTs, the denominator should be the number of patients who were randomized to each, right? That's one way. The other way is compare the characteristics of the patients who were lost to follow-up to characteristics of patients who stayed in the study. If people who were lost to follow-up were vastly different from people who remained in the study, then you have some serious validity threats, right? And then lastly, you can always report best case scenario, worst case scenario. This is kind of a sensitivity analysis that you analyze your data and then you say, let's consider all the people who lost to follow-up have the bad outcome. Let's consider them all good outcome. And then you just put it out there and allow the readers to decide what to do with it. Whatever you do not ignore the loss to follow-up patients. If they do ignore it, that's not good. That's serious. That's a serious problem. The paper that Noah picked discusses the paper that Noah picked discusses the treatment of appendicitis in children, whether non-operative or surgical treatment. It's an observational, non-randomized trial. It's a relatively complicated, long paper, so I suggest we just focus on the method section and the results section up to the secondary analysis. There's no reason to go through the secondary analysis and post-hoc analysis. They really don't need. So start from the checklist or from the paper, start from the method section and results section. Particularly pay attention to biases that arise from the study being a non-randomized trial, and also pay attention to the loss to follow-up and see how they handle the patients that were lost to follow-up. Any questions? Okay, where do we go from here?
Yep.